Just ask my wife or my kids, and on the other hand, my grandchildren think I'm terrific. Okay, what we're going to be talking about is a Jewish approach to civic engagement. And what I want to do is I want to approach it from two different perspectives. First historical and then theological. Historically, until the Enlightenment, Jews were at best tolerated in both Muslim and Christian societies, and therefore their engagement in those kinds of societies was minimal. It was sometimes, especially in Islamic societies, Jews were the Sultan's doctor, or sometimes, once in a while, an advisor. But by and large, in the vast majority of places where Jews lived before the Enlightenment, they were not asked to get involved in government, and as a matter of fact, were usually not officially citizens of the realm. That changed with the Enlightenment, which is, as you probably know, began with thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau. These are 17th, early 18th century thinkers. The first time that you get governments that are founded on Enlightenment principles are in the late 1700s with Franz Joseph in Germany in the 1760s, the American Revolution, later the French Revolution, and that made an immense difference. That made an immense difference for Jews because until then, all of the societies in which they were living were governed by a kind of what's sometimes called a corporate understanding of identity. That is, when you were born, you were identified as a member of a particular community, and your status within the government was a function of the community status within the government. So if you were born in a Jew in either a Muslim or a Christian society, then you were, as I said, at best tolerated, and there were very, very specific restrictions as to where you could live, what you could do for a living, a whole series of things like that. And with the Enlightenment basically brought about a complete Copernican revolution on that. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. What am I quoting? Declaration of Independence. Jefferson cribbed that from John Locke, who had written that 100 years earlier. But Locke had said life, liberty, and property, and Jefferson changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and you can imagine how many doctoral dissertations have been written about that one. But in any case, what it amounts to is, when you're born, you're not a member of a community, you are an individual with rights. And everybody born within a given community is an individual with rights, including no matter what your religion happens to be. So that was an immense revolution in the way in which Jews understood their position within a community. And it took a number of decades, actually, for this to have its full effect. But interestingly, Napoleon, in 1807, 1808, called together what he called the French Sanhedrin, that is a group of Jewish leaders which he called the Sanhedrin, after the old Sanhedrin of antiquity, and he posed to them a whole series of questions that were actually prescient in terms of how he understood what this new ideology was going to mean for Jews, and he asked them questions that go very much to the heart of what will it mean to be a Jew in the new Enlightenment society. And his Secretary of State put it very bluntly, to the Jews as Jews, nothing, to the Jews as Frenchmen, everything. In other words, if the Jews were going to continue to function according to the old way of thinking about things, that you are a member of a minority community, then this new Enlightenment ideology was not going to make any difference whatsoever in their status. They were going to be at best tolerated. But if they were, in fact, if the Jews were, in fact, going to buy into this new ideology, then they would be full French citizens. So the questions that he posed to them include the following. Will you speak French, as opposed to, say, Yiddish or something in that order? Will you take your disputes to French courts, as opposed to Jewish courts? Right, which would be a major change, because under the old corporate system, if you were a Jew and you had a dispute with another Jew, you had to take your dispute to the Jewish court, and you would not take it to the king's courts, because if you did, the likelihood was that the king's court would say a plague on both your houses and punish you both for bothering the king's court with your disputes, and probably punish the whole Jewish community to begin, altogether for that infringement on the king's rights. So, I mean, you took your disputes to the Jewish courts, your disputes with other Jews to the Jewish courts. But now Napoleon would say, will you take your disputes to the French courts? Will you, and this is a hard one, will you marry other French citizens who don't happen to be Jewish? Right? He asked that. Will you go to French schools? Right? I mean, these are all, as I said, these were really prescient questions, because he really was taking the ideology of the Enlightenment and saying, well, if you really are going to be an individual with rights, living among other individuals with rights as members of French society, then to what extent are you going to assimilate into French society? And as you may know, the French to this day are having real problems with all of that. Because, as you may have been reading in the newspapers over the last number of years, there are now French laws that forbid people from wearing, it was really designed at the Muslims, from wearing head coverings that the women do in some forms of Islam, that will not make it clear as to what your identity is. Because this is really a form of secular French identity that one could say, I think, with some justification, is basically anti-religious. In other words, if you're going to be an individual in the French society, then you have to understand the French society is determining your identity. In America, of course, that was very different. The experience of Jews in America has been that of a gradual acceptance within American society. So there have been Jews in these United States in 1654. First group of Jews came to New Amsterdam at the time, later called New York, and Peter Stuyvesant did not allow them to stay there, and so they then went on to Roger Williams, Rhode Island. And so the very first Jews lived in Newport, Rhode Island. By the time you get to the Revolutionary War, you get a number of Jews who are supporting the revolution, and including Chaim Solomon, one of the people who found got money for George Washington. And Washington visited the synagogue in Newport when he became president, and he wrote a letter to the Jews of Newport, which has been quoted over and over again, that this is a land that will give to bigotry no sanction, so that this will be a land in which you will be able to function fully as citizens. That was George Washington. However, from the experience of Jews in America, by the way, the vast majority of Jews who live here today their ancestors came in the late 1800s, early 1900s, from Eastern Europe and from Russia, and that was from 1881 until 1923 when the immigration laws changed. So most of us who are Jews in America are descendants of people who came much later than 1654. And the experience in America was mixed. I'll say it very honestly. A lot of anti-Semitism in America in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Quotas at some of the best schools as to how many Jews they would accept, in terms of graduate schools, also including the Ivy League and including some public schools as well, some public universities as well. There were landed covenants in America until the U.S. Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional in 1948. But these were covenants that continued with the sale of land that barred Jews, Catholics, and Negroes, basically. And that continued again until the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. So there were various kinds of professions in which Jews were simply not accepted, and it was and that included medicine, that included law, that included business of various sorts, especially the financial forms of business. So I mean, the experience of Jews in America, despite the legal status of Jews, as from the Constitution to our own day, was very mixed. If you haven't read the book or seen the movie Gentleman's Agreement, that may be something that you might want to see. Gregory Peck, no less, plays a Christian reporter for a journalist who has a friend who is Jewish, and this Jewish friend was saying that he can't go to various places, and Gregory Peck doesn't believe him. This is after the Second World War. Okay? This is 1946. Gregory Peck, the one that Gregory Peck plays, doesn't believe him, and so he makes reservations at various hotels and at resorts of various sorts, and then as he's registering, he lets it slip that he's Jewish. Of course he's not, but he's pretending to be, and all of a sudden there's no room at the inn. And that includes things like hotels and resorts and golf clubs and a whole variety of other things. And it's a fictional story, but it's historical fiction, because through even after the Second World War, there was discrimination of that sort. So the question then becomes, what is and by the way, I just heard a lecture the other day by somebody who really studies this. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not, who the Jews really loved, because, as did most Americans, because he got us out of the Depression, and he ultimately won the war, and all of that. But there were a lot of things that Roosevelt did that were decidedly anti-Semitic, despite the fact that his wife pleaded with him to allow you ever hear the Spirit of St. Louis? There's another movie you might want to, it's a thing called The Ship of Fools. It was a ship that left Hamburg, Germany in 1939 for Cuba, because Cuba had said that they would open their doors to Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust. And then they get to Cuba, and they were not allowed to disembark, and so they were then off the coast of Florida. And Roosevelt was asked whether he could allow these people to come in, and he refused. So they had to go back to Europe, and most of those people were killed. He did not allow. There were X number of slots according to the laws in place at the time for people from various countries, and he did not allow those slots to be filled by Jews. This goes to the highest realms of American government, that this was in fact in place. A lot of that changed during the 1950s, but especially during the 1960s and thereafter. I was born in 1943. You don't have to guess, I'm 69 years old. I'll be 70, God willing, in another 2 months. And when I was growing up, I was born and raised in Milwaukee. When I was growing up, we Jews were very much celebrating, as the Supreme Court increasingly was creating a very strong wall of separation between church and state. Because as a very small minority in what is largely a Christian society, the greater the separation between church and state, the better it would be for us. Simply because then minority rights would be respected. And I remember, I went to public schools all my life. And I remember when the Supreme Court ruled that there had to be release time in the public schools for those who wanted to get religious instruction. And the reason why that was important in my case was because Hebrew school started at 4 o'clock and regular school ended at 3:30, and it took more than half an hour to get from one to the other. So on Mondays and Wednesdays, I got out at 3:15 as a result of the Supreme Court ruling in order to make it to Hebrew school on time. And you had, later on, you had the Supreme Court ruling about no prayer in the public schools. So, I mean, there was, you know, as a Jew growing up in the 1950s and 60s, it was, I saw it as being a real, the separation of church and state, the stronger that it was a real bulwark for religious liberty and for protection from the majority. I still remember very vividly that in public schools I attended, there was always the Christmas pageant. And for 2 months before Christmas, we were learning Christmas songs to sing at the pageant. As it happens, in 6th grade, I was elected president of the class, and when we started in November, learning all kinds of Christmas songs, I decided that I could sing Frosty the Snowman and things like that, Winter Wonderland, but I couldn't sing a number of the distinctly Christian songs because I didn't believe them. Okay, and because I was president of the class, the teacher was very upset with me because I was then, you know, a model for the other students, the Jewish students, not to sing these songs. Right? It was only much later in my life that I realized I sing all kinds of songs that I don't believe. There's many of them that I don't even understand. So it's, but that's, music has its own value apart from whatever the lyrics are. But it's and I must say, the school where I went, maybe about 15 or 20% of the students were Jewish, and they did make an attempt. They had some Hanukkah songs along with the Christmas songs, but I have to tell you the Christmas songs are much better than the Hanukkah songs musically. So, I mean, they tried, okay, but it was, it was very clear that I was living in a Christian society, even though I was going to public schools. So that's what I grew up with. And then I found myself being asked to be, as you heard, on Hillary Clinton's healthcare task force. May it rest in peace. And what was clear to me, I was on the ethics committee of that. It was committee number 17 of the task force. And on that committee were 5 physicians and 3 nurses and several public policy people. And a priest, 2 ministers, and a rabbi. Now, I have a doctorate in moral philosophy from Columbia, so I wasn't there as, there were also 5 secular ethicists. Okay? I wasn't there, clearly, as a secular ethicist. I was there as a rabbi. As you heard, I also then was later asked to give testimony on embryonic stem cell research and on stem cell research and on cloning before the President's National Bioethics Advisory Commission. Again, not as an ethicist. I do a lot of writing in that work, but as a rabbi. And then I was on the Surgeon General's Commission to create a call for action for responsible sexual behavior. The Surgeon General was interested primarily in stopping sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS. That was a group of about 60 people, but I was also on the executive committee of that group, which was about 12 people. And I still remember we were sitting around the table at the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington. There were, I think, 10 or 12 of us. And every one of the people around had multiple degrees, right? Graduate degrees of various sorts. And they were all calling each other by their first names. Me, they were calling Rabbi. So at one point I said, you know, I do have a first name, it's Elliot, and you're welcome to use it. And the chair, the assistant secretary, who was the chair of this, who was an Irish Catholic from Boston, said, if my mother ever found out that I called the rabbi by his first name, there would be hell to pay. So most of the others began to call me Elliot, but sort of in a very hesitating way. But there were still some that insisted on calling me rabbi. Okay, and finally I was on this National Human Resources, well not finally, the National Human Resources Protections Advisory Commission, and there again, it was clear that I wasn't there as a philosopher or an ethicist, I was there as a rabbi. And now I'm on a commission for the state of California on embryonic stem cell research, where the legislation specifically says that the members of this commission are supposed to be X number of secular ethicists, a priest, 2 ministers, and a rabbi. Okay, so that's California legislation. So this has then led me to reconsider exactly what is the role of religion in public policy. And I ultimately wrote about this. I'm going to sort of describe it to you. This is in a book called To Do the Right and the Good, A Jewish Approach to Modern Social Ethics. And there's a chapter here on Judaism and national policy, which very much involves my reflections on this, given the fact that, on the one hand, just instinctually, I believe very strongly in a wall of separation between church and state, and on the other hand, here I am on all of these various government commissions, functioning not as an ethicist, but functioning as a rabbi. So, let me just say from the beginning that you have to sort of ask yourself, when you're talking about religion and public policy, you have to ask yourself what your understanding of the American structure is to begin with. And what became clear to me is that there are several different understandings of that. My own understanding very much mirrors Thomas Jefferson's. Jefferson said that where Americans, by and large, agree on a given moral issue, then there can be legislation about that issue. So Americans agree about laws against murder, theft, rape, that kind of thing, fraud, and so you can have laws about those kinds of things. And that's negative laws, and then positively, Americans agree that children should be educated, and so you can have laws that require parents to educate their children. Americans agree, sometimes grudgingly, that there ought to be taxes. Exactly what those taxes should be is a matter of debate, but Americans agree that if you want to have a functioning government, then you're going to have taxes, and so there can be laws having to do with taxes. But where Americans don't agree, in very large percentages, on given moral issues, Jefferson said, then the government should stay out of it. And that, by and large, is the way that I understand things. That doesn't mean that you should have what Richard John Newhouse called a naked public square, by which he meant a public square in which people are bereft of any of their religious convictions. That's not really the kind of Jeffersonian model. The model is rather that it's very, actually Talmudic, it's also Aristotelian. The model is that you come together to determine public policy, bringing with you your convictions, whatever they are, and the presumption is that through debate, very vigorous debate, that you would ultimately come to a much wiser public policy than if people came to that discussion pretending that they didn't have the convictions that they have. And so the presumption here, and it really is an epistemological presumption, that is a presumption based upon how you come to know things, right? That you will come to know the best policy. You'll create the wisest policy for the United States if people come with their various convictions and, if necessary, yell and scream at each other, but at least but have this kind of vigorous public debate, and then create a policy in which, First Amendment issues here, in which no religion gets to establish what the policy will be. Right? That's the establishment clause of the First Amendment, where nobody gets to trump everybody else based upon some claim to religious conviction. But on the other hand, where you have to preserve the free exercise, the second clause of the First Amendment, you have to preserve the free exercise of religion to the greatest extent possible. So that will be, and that, by the way, I'm very proud to, let me just say this straight up, I'm very proud to be an American for a whole series of reasons, but perhaps the chief among them is that America is the greatest experiment in pluralism that has ever existed on the face of the earth. We do not, it's not without its bumps. Certainly the anti-Semitism that I was talking about before is one such bump. I was, as a college student in the 1960s, I was very much involved with the civil rights movement and teaching 7th graders in Harlem who were reading on a 2nd grade reading level every Thursday afternoon for my first 3 years of college, and then my last year in college, I was at a different junior high school in Harlem teaching 9th graders who, if anybody was going to go to college, these were the kids. So I was doing enrichment work with them, and I still remember there was one day in the middle of the year when the boys had a program of their own, so I had the girls by themselves, and they said to me, these are 9th grade girls, what do we need this for? We're going to get pregnant in another year or two, right? And drop out of high school. And you could have wiped this white boy off the floor, right? I said to them,